You know, we often think that we're talking with one another, but in reality, we're talking at one another. So the things I'm telling somebody, even though I intend for them to be perceived in a certain way, are going to be basically perceived according to that person's background, according to their ideological and cultural upbringing. And that is why the world of today is so chaotic. We cannot communicate properly with one another. And that is why we need to have an objective language, especially when it comes to sustainability and bringing about actual solutions to the world's problems. Language can often be a barrier, leading to conflict and misunderstanding. However, if we know how to communicate properly, proper use of language can lead to a deeper sense of connection and problem resolution. You know, Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel has a right to defend itself. What about October 7th? What about October 7th? Israel has a right to defend itself. Why do words have such a huge impact on human behavior? I could start by talking about many subjects, but for reference, let's talk about World War I. What motivated 500,000 baker's sons, farm boys, and industrial workers to travel 6,000 miles across the world to butcher 500,000 German baker's sons, farm boys, and industrial workers? Well, looking back, we can see that World War I was completely pointless. All that destruction, waste of resources, murder, disruption of families, depression, alcoholism, drug abuse, not to mention a colossal waste of taxpayer money, was for nothing. Absolutely nothing. For the average citizen of the world, for the average American, it was absolutely nothing. But for the bankers, yes, it was quite a bit of profit, quite a tremendous amount of profit. For the bankers, for the corporations, the military-industrial complex. And why? Just because a psychopath got up on a podium and spoke certain words to motivate and galvanize the nation to do something, and another psychopath got on a newspaper, wrote certain words to manipulate public perception to make us go to war. As activists and sustainability advocates, we have to realize that the capitalist system often uses language and manipulative language to sway public perception, right? As a system of exploitation, competition, and hierarchy, capitalism relies on language that can instill fear, instill hopelessness, to give our critical faculties up to the system and to our so-called elected leaders and those in positions of power to do as they will with us. This is how the culture, a totally unsustainable culture, is actually maintained. This is how the status quo is preserved. Social memes, right? Ideas, presupposed principles of preference are basically ideas and social memes that are often, they're transferred easily from person to person, generation after generation. And when it comes to preserving the capitalist system, the capitalist hierarchy, language is used in a way to manipulate our perception and to construe and cover up the facts, cover up the truth. And that's why semantics and the meaning of words needs to be understood for what it is. Because language is used by the capitalist system as a tool of control. And if we want to bring about sustainable change, we have to be objective and very efficient in our choice of words to bring about a proper message, right? Let me give you an example. So if I were to tell people, the average person, that I'm against the idea of private property, well, if I don't break it down, if I don't explain to them properly what I mean and what I actually advocate for instead of private property, they're gonna think, well, what are you, some violent communist who wants to seize my property, who want to violently seize my property? Well, if I'm given a chance to explain myself, and if I'm actually able to use the right words, it might be something like, well, no, man, I'm not into any isms, really. I'm not into any outdated isms. I'm not into the violent overthrow of people, the seizure of their property. Instead, I advocate for a system of access. So instead of everybody hoarding something, everybody owning one of every car, given our 21st century technology, we can actually have automatically driven cars using satellite technology, right? Cars that are automatically guided. So that way you use an app with your phone, the car picks you up, drops you off somewhere, and then it can go on its way to pick up other people. That way we can reduce the need for cars tremendously. So preserving resources, not wasting energy, and ultimately giving up the idea of cars altogether. The entire industry is a scam. Public transportation is what should be encouraged and what should be advocated. You don't want to own things just for the sake of owning them. You want to have access to those things for their utility. So if you have public transportation, everybody can have access to efficient transportation, and you can make it in a sustainable way. my advocation against it is not from a moral standpoint, it's mostly from a sustainability standpoint, because it's wasteful. Private property is wasteful, and also the ruling class having access to having so much ownership of massive amounts of resources is basically withholding those resources from other people. So objectively, it is inhumane. It is unsustainable. It is leading to deprivation and the waste of our resources and our energy. Instead of having people jump to knee-jerk reactions, we have to be very careful with our choice of words to explain things in a proper way. And again, the sad reality is that we live in the 21st century where we can launch a rocket to go into space, travel incredibly long distances, for that rocket to spin around into the gravity of Mars, land the rocket, and then have a robot roll out onto the planet, collect the soil sample, get back into the spacecraft, and then fly that all the way back home. We can do these kind of incredible technological feats, yet we cannot talk to one another as brothers and sisters, as human beings. We cannot speak about proper solutions to the world's problems. Politicians are fighting with one another. Families are fighting with one another. We can do incredible things with our technology, yet we cannot communicate with one another properly. Because, like I said at the beginning, oftentimes when I'm trying to talk to somebody about complex ideas, right, like politics and economics, the things I'm telling them are often, even though I intend for them to be perceived a certain way, to the person who's receiving the message, things are only perceived through the filtration mechanism, through the filter of their mind, meaning the kind of culture they have, the kind of upbringing they have, their educational background is what their filtration mechanism, and what enables them to perceive the message in the way that their value system enables them. When we try to have somebody perceive a message, it is often not perceived in the way that it's intended to be perceived. But there is a solution. Science has a way of achieving a solution to this problem. Our scientific capability allows us to have an objective means of communicating solutions and communicating a way to really keep our world together. Otherwise, why is our world even held together? Why are some things working? If I was a chemist and I wrote a formula to another chemist in Japan, right? That chemist in Japan would read the formula in the exact way that it's intended to be read, right? That's why science is truly objective, and a lot of sustainability organizations do not look at it that way, and they don't advocate for the application of science, the scientific method, to the social system itself. When two architects, when two engineers, when two doctors are talking about certain things that applies to their scientific fields, their language is quite efficient, right? Otherwise, you cannot build a house, you cannot build a car, you cannot do studies and have those studies be replicated by other scientists and arrive at those same solutions. I think there is a way to have an objective means to communicate with one another, and that really, science is the answer. But the controllers, the people who control the social narrative, those in positions of power, do not want this reality to come about. They don't want people to have a clear means of communicating with one another. When we talk about the idea that, hey, you know what, I'm against capitalism, it's unsustainable. They want people to, especially in the United States where I live, they want everyone to think that if you're not for capitalism, you must be a communist, you must be a socialist. Aren't there dozens of political ideologies and ways of organizing society? Well, the leaders, the owners of our society, the ruling class, would not want you to know these facts. They want you to jump to knee-jerk reactions, to use the more simplistic parts of your brain, right? Using fear and control to dominate society. And they don't want you to use your critical faculties. They don't want people to think critically about the world around them. We have this thing called the limbic system, right? The reptilian brain as well, the more simple part of our brain that has been hardwired through millions of years of evolution. The fear response, right? The fight or flight response. Capitalism is a system that is extremely primitive, and it brings out primitive responses of our brains, and language and the means of communication is so simplified that it often forces us to reduce our cognitive capacity to not think broadly about the world's problems. You say things like, competition is just the way it is. Competition is the best way to innovate in society. It's human nature to want to be greedy and competitive. That's just the way it is. That's just the way society has been formed. That is very simplistic language. That is very simplistic language. Instead of saying, hey, you know what? It is in our nature to not be restrained by our nature. We are products of our environment, especially when it comes to human beings. We have a thing called the neurofrontal cortex, We can think rationally and objectively about the world. We can use our critical thinking to not jump to rapid conclusions and not be swept up by our emotions, to get triggered, and not allowing the rulers and the controllers to manipulate the social narrative. So, let's give another example. Let's talk about, for example, violence, specifically mass shootings. Oftentimes in the media and people in general, if somebody pulls out a gun and kills a few people in public randomly, right? What seems like a random act of shooting. Again, the simplistic language is that person was just a horrible person. He was evil. He was a maligned human being, and he must be locked away and, lock him away, throw away the key. That is often the simplistic language we use to condemn acts of violence. Our entire criminal justice system, which is a criminal system, it jumps to simplistic language to maintain the status quo. I would say something like this. Statistically, societies with more inequality actually experience more violence. So inequality, the more inequality, the more violence there is, because human beings as social primates, we don't like to see other people gaining more than us. It makes us feel dehumanized and disrespected and disregarded, right? That is why the greater the income gap there is in developed countries, the more violence there is. So one solution, instead of the criminal justice system, which seeks to just punish people, right, for stepping out of line, I don't believe in condemnation or forgiveness. I believe in understanding what are the social conditions that lead to people committing acts of violence. And we often find out, if you are actually to enable people to feel a sense of self-pride and self-love, of accomplishments and autonomy and mastery over developing skills that reward them in their life, and having a society which actually allows people to have access to resources where there's not a massive income gap. It's just silly, all this materialism about somebody driving a Lamborghini and somebody driving a hoopty, like a broken down car. That's very dehumanizing. And it's been shown through massive amounts of studies and research, right? The books Violence and Preventing Violence by James Gilligan, PhD in criminal psychiatry from Massachusetts University, who studied the most violent people. And he often came to the same conclusion. After interviewing more than 10,000 violent criminals, they often said they felt dehumanized and disrespected. That is why they jumped to those acts of violence. The way to prevent violence and the way to make those who are more prone and vulnerable to behaving in a violent manner, to prevent those issues, we have to bring about a society and advocate for a society which makes people feel included, not excluded, makes people feel loved and respected. And the way to do that, obviously, this is where it becomes very uncomfortable for the average person and for the politicians and for the people in control, power, in the positions of power. They don't want people to talk like this, because when you come to these conclusions, you realize the entire criminal justice system is a failure. It's a massive failure. It doesn't accomplish anything. It doesn't solve problems. And then when you start questioning that, you can see how it's tied into the capitalist system. The financial system, the banking, the economic system is all tied in one massive structure that seeks to maintain order. And as we can see, it leads to violence, instability, war, conflicts, and environmental destruction. Using the right words and breaking things down properly, it is not going to be simple to talk about solutions for the world's problems. It is not going to be simple to convey a message and convince people to understand that we have to get to a new kind of social arrangement and to build communities and transition, from this aspect of capitalism to a new socioeconomic paradigm that can benefit everybody. It is not going to be easy. It's going to be very difficult, but we have to engage in this kind of communication. And then let's talk about politics a little bit. The political system, right? Especially in the United States, they use a language of doublespeak oftentimes. Politicians use doublespeak to convince the population, as I mentioned, like World War I, right? To brainwash the population to commit horrendous acts of atrocities on other people who otherwise would never have harmed them. They have never harmed them, yet we willingly give up our freedom and go to war and commit mass murder just for billionaires to get wealthy. When the United States says that they want to bring freedom and democracy to the Middle East, what did they really do? Well, the wars in the Middle East, the invasion of Iraq, invasion of Afghanistan, the destabilization of Libya, Syria, Sudan, Somalia, what's going on in Palestine right now. When they say they want freedom and democracy, that is actually decoded for the freedom of the wealthy and the powerful to exploit and dominate those who are vulnerable. So it's really the freedom of the wealthy to exploit the poor for profits. When the capitalists talk about efficiency, economic efficiency, what do they actually mean again? Economic efficiency under capitalism is market efficiency, the ability for a company, a corporation to have turnover in sales, Well, what does that translate to actual resource efficiency? Well, a company like Apple, intentionally designing phones and just all products across all industries designed intentionally to break down after a certain point. So you have to go back and purchase it again, right? Turnover in sales. So things not being made to last, things being intrinsically obsolete, which again translates to insane, just an outrageous amounts of resource waste and pollution, resource inefficiency. But under capitalism, it is market efficiency. So there's a disconnect. There's a massive disconnect in what is really what is talked about and what is actually happening in reality. And that is why economic efficiency under capitalism, market efficiency, is actually lifeline, is destructive, ecocidal, and it leads to injury to people. It harms us in a social way. But in a new economic system that's based on environmental preservation and the improvement of public health, well, those types of economic efficiency would be completely counter and diametrically opposed to the mechanics of capitalism. Semantics, which is the meaning of words, a big part of activism, of bringing about a transition to a better world, really comes down to massive communications projects. We have to engage, basically, well, transform minds. We're trying to transform minds and elevate people's values to understand that we have to, as a global society, become one village if we want to see a better world. And now, as I'm winding down to the end of the video, I want to talk about the word love. As the late, great Jacques Fresco, industrial designer, inventor, social engineer, as he told me personally, he said the word love is quite literally a bullshit word. It doesn't really mean anything. The best way to actually show love to other people and to the world is through action, really. Improving people's lives. And that's why Jacques Fresco said the word love needs to be replaced with extensionality, right? So technology and science is actually an extension of human attributes. It's the way in which we can relay and we can connect with the world around us and solve problems, improve the lives of humanity, right? Bring about more environmental sustainability. And that is why scientists who solve problems are actually loving people, because they're being extensional to the world around them. The language in itself is not enough. We have to have a method of application when it comes to the larger order things, the systemic change that we want to bring about. We want to bring about a better world. And if we want to achieve these things, we have to be able to be objective in our language. And again, if you want to change the human being, you change the culture and the environment in which they are raised, and change the culture, you shall change the human being. All right, guys, peace and much love. I'll see you guys next time.
We need a system of instrumentation for social design. A system of instrumentation that will give a decision that has no investment. That there's no way linguistically and emotionally and people with hang-ups, different vested interests, and a different set can possibly sit down and evaluate a situation. Whereas instrumentation is not perfect, but it's by far